centered on preventive health. And today we are excited to start with a very important topic. And we are more excited to have a person who is very engrossed into that subject to really take us through that. We have Dr. Kimberly Lockwood, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of San Francisco. And now he's the executive director of the National Health of Aging Stress Management Measurement Network. And we're excited that she could join us. I want you to just pay attention to every single presentation she's going to give, and note your questions down. You are just watching us via our Facebook, so you can send your questions via the comment section. Then we will read it after the presentation. Dr. Kim is ready to answer every single question that you have for her today, right? So we are going to start soon, and you can share the link to other people for them to also join us. And we are going to have an awesome time that you will never regret watching us. So Dr. Kim, we are ready, and you are ready.
All right, great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about what I do and about my research, and also generally about stress and cardiovascular disease. I'm going to get my slides going for just a second. And
okay.
All right, are we seeing that okay?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay, so as Peter mentioned, I am going to be talking a bit about psychosocial stress and cardiovascular disease risk. I'm going to be talking specifically about some measurement considerations, as well as different pathways that we can think about when we're thinking about the relationship between stress and cardiovascular disease. Then I'm going to walk through some examples of some applications for this kind of research, and then we can think at the end about how this might apply to the physicians in the audience, and I'm, again, happy to take questions. I'll stop at the end of each section so we can go through any questions that people have in the meantime. So I just want to kind of get all on the same page about a few things before I actually launch into things. So first, Peter mentioned that I'm executive director of the Stress Measurement Network. And just to give you a little bit more context about what this is, the Stress Measurement Network is funded by the National Institutes of Aging here in the US. And our mission is to better understand the relationship between stress and health, specifically by improving the measurement of psychosocial stress. And we do this through connecting with stress researchers around the globe. We're centered at University of California, San Francisco, but we really work with people everywhere. The co-directors are Dr. Alyssa Eppel and Dr. Wendy Berry-Mendez, and the associate directors are Dr. Alexander Croswell and Eric Prather. So we all work together on the leadership team, but we're connected with a really broad range of researchers and clinicians across the globe. And I just want to point out before I launch into this that this is a huge area of research. Cardiovascular disease and stress encompasses a wide array of topics, a wide array of focuses. And the purpose of this webinar is not to give you an exhaustive description of the entire field. It would be completely impossible to do that. But I do want to focus on ways that health psychologists, which is what I am, ways that health psychologists think about and study the role of stress in health and cardiovascular disease, and also kind of go into two specific sub areas within this broader field of stress and talk about how you can think about pathways. And I also want to point out, I know we have an international audience, which is really exciting. I do want to point out that a lot of my research is going to be focused primarily on the United States, and that's what my expertise is in. But I do encourage you to think about how these same kinds of models could be applied to your country or your culture, whatever that may be. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about how these things may differ at the end if people are interested in discussing that. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about, I'm first going to just give an introduction and overview of stress measurement. Like I said, that's kind of my expertise area, and it's helpful to get us all on the same page with the same terminology. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about different pathways that link stress with cardiovascular disease risk. and then go into some applications of how we examine those pathways, specifically looking at early life adversity as an example and discrimination. And then we can talk about next steps, some additional resources, and really go into more discussion about how this applies to your work. Okay, so first, I just want to start out by talking really broadly about what stress is. So stress is a really, really extremely broad topic. Most people can identify when they're experiencing stress, but we don't always talk about how to define stress. And this is partly because stress is actually just a very vague construct. There's a lot of things, a lot of experiences that can really fall within this broader range of what stress is. So things like public speaking in front of an audience, feeling overwhelmed by work or school, financial troubles or unemployment, something as major as experiencing a natural disaster or abuse and violence. And also something that's very current and relevant to all of us right now is experiencing a global pandemic. It's an extremely stressful thing to be experiencing, and it has many different kind of components of what makes it difficult and stressful for us to deal with. So just from this really small sample of stressors, you can see how broad the construct of stress is. How are all of these things subsumed within the same construct of stress? So I just want to tell you kind of upfront, the way I define stress is really as an umbrella term. So it's encompassing experiences and responses when the environmental demands of a situation outweigh an individual's perceived psychological and physiological ability to cope with it or to manage it effectively. And it's important to think about kind of common terminology when we're going through and talking about stress and health. So that's what I want to focus on just for a few minutes. So one of the goals of the Stress Measurement Network has been to provide both scientists and clinicians with the terminology to talk about stress so that we all are on the same page. And to do this, we can try to pull out some of the core components or elements of existing measures and conceptualizations of stress. And at a high level, there are two kind of sets of characteristics that we have to talk about when we're thinking about stress, and we have to differentiate between them. These are stressor exposures, so potentially stressful events or experiences, things that people might say, oh yes, that would be stressful. And then we also have to think about stress responses. So how are we as individuals specifically psychologically responding to stress? How are we behaviorally responding to stress? And how are we physiologically responding to stress? So you have to think about these two kind of different ways of thinking about stress when we're examining stress and health. So some of the important characteristics that we have to think of when it comes to stress exposure are things like time scale. So how long does the stressor last? Is it an acute stressor that happens over the course of a few minutes or maybe a shorter period of time? Is it a hassle that you experience in your day-to-day life, something like commuting to work, which I'm not doing right now because I'm working from home until probably next year. So I have removed that stressor at least. But there's also things like major life events, like, for example, getting divorced or dealing with bereavement. And these stressors, many stressors can last for a long time and they can become chronic stressors. So chronic stressors is one of the kind of most potent ways of thinking about stress in terms of our health. We also have to think about life period. When did the stressor occur? At what point in our life were we at when we experienced the stressor? Was it in utero? Was it actually a stressor experienced by our mother when she was carrying us? And how did that impact our bodies? How did that transmit to our bodies when we were in utero? We can also think about stress in childhood, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more about, but also stress in adulthood, and then stress over the course of the lifespan. And that kind of connects back into those chronic stressors I was mentioning. And then when we're measuring stress, we also have to think about assessment window. When are we measuring the stressor in regard to when it actually occurred? So are we asking people to remember something that happened a long time ago? Are we asking them to remember something that happened just a few minutes ago? What's the time frame, and how does the time frame really affect what we're asking them? Our memories aren't perfect. So how do our memories kind of come into what we're thinking about when it comes to stress? And then, of course, there's a lot of other different stressor-specific attributes we have to think about when we're thinking about measuring stressors, or even if you're thinking about screening your patients for stressors. How severe was the stressor? How controllable is the stressor? How predictable was the stressor? So it turns out that stressors that are uncontrollable and unpredictable really have the biggest impact on our minds and our bodies. I'm sure that doesn't surprise a lot of you, but something I've been thinking a lot about with the pandemic is that it really is something that most of us have very little ability to control, and it's very unpredictable how it's going to impact us. So this is something that it's not just relevant for stress researchers. We're all going through something right now that's totally unpredictable and uncontrollable. In terms of stress responses, there's when we're talking about stress responses, we're really thinking about appraisals and perceptions of a situation, as well as our kind of affective and emotional and cognitive and physiological responses to it. And of course, there's a lot of different ways that we can measure this. A lot of times in large studies, we're really just measuring global perceptions of stress. So in general, how overwhelmed does a person feel? These can be helpful to measure, but they're not specific. We don't really know what they're overwhelmed about. We don't necessarily know why or kind of how that happened. But a lot of times when people are just including a quick measure, they're just focusing on kind of these global perceptions. We can also assess people's kind of subjective stress responses within a specific life domain. So within, for example, work stress. So what kind of experiences of stress are you having with your job? I know my sister is a physician and she is having some really extreme stress right now with dealing with the pandemic and her job. And then of course we can think about people's subjective responses to a specific event. So is there a specific event that is occurring that we want to measure responses to, such as you know, a fight with a spouse or something like that. And then there's lots of different kinds of stress responses. We can think about people's emotional responses, like negative and positive affect, specific emotions, their coping behaviors like smoking or overeating, or even more positive things like strategies for seeking out social support. And then of course, we can also measure physiological responses. So how are our bodies responding to stress? Do we see an increase in blood pressure? Do we see an increase in heart rate? The field of stress really broadly encompasses all of these different types of stress. And it's important to keep that in mind. And it's really helpful, like I said, to use a common terminology that encompasses the complexity of stress to help move us forward. And this is true both in research and in medicine. Okay, so now that I've kind of covered some of the basics, I want to shift into talking a bit more about stress and health specifically. Importantly, both stressor exposures and stress responses are related to really a broad range of health outcomes. And this relationship is a pretty complex one. So I'm not going to go through this model in detail, but I did want to show it to you. It's something that was published by our Stress Network group a few years ago. And I'm showing it to you not to scare you off of thinking about the importance of stress, but rather just to give you a sample of the different areas of stress science that might be interesting to you. And there's a lot of different ways to think about how stress might be impacting an individual's body and mind. You can think about the front half of this model, things like contextual factors. What are people bringing into the experience of stress that's triggering different ways that they react to it? You can think about protective factors. What kind of resources do they have when they're going into an experience of stress? Do they have social resources? Do they have people who are supporting them? Do they have financial resources, material resources? And then habitual processes are kind of what is our mindset? What is our mindset of dealing with stress and coping with stress? And then in the middle here, we really have all the different ways that you can think, or many of the different ways that you can think about kind of different levels of stressors, different timescales of stressors. And then ultimately, we're thinking about how they impact our bodies, both in the short term and the long term. So again, don't want to go through this in too much detail. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but I want to zoom out now, and instead of just focusing really broadly on stress and health, I want to zoom back in and focus on stress exposure and cardiovascular disease risk. This is a little bit more manageable of a model for us to think about. And as we're moving forward, I just want to point out that I'm going to be using CVD as an abbreviation for cardiovascular disease as we're moving forward. And I'm talking about that broadly with the many diseases that fall within cardiovascular disease. And just to explain a little bit about why I'm talking about cardiovascular disease in particular, why I use cardiovascular disease as a model, Cardiovascular disease is a chronic disease, as I'm sure all of you know, is a chronic disease that develops over the course of decades. It develops as a function of many, many risk factors that can begin as early as childhood and play out over the course of the lifespan. And many of these factors are stress related. So this gives us an opportunity to examine pathways before people actually get clinically ill. So looking at these pathways before people get sick, looking at stress exposure and cardiovascular disease gives us more opportunities to think about prevention and intervention. So why, again, cardiovascular disease? I'm going to be showing you some statistics from the US, but a lot of these are paralleled in other countries. So cardiovascular disease is highly prevalent in the United States and other developed nations. This graph is just showing the percentage of individuals from different age groups that are living with some form of cardiovascular disease. As you can see, it increases with age. And cardiovascular disease in general is the leading cause of death in the United States and other developed nations. Obviously, we're living in a pandemic right now that is killing a lot of people, so just have that in mind. But the other reason why I study cardiovascular disease is that there are really striking disparities in cardiovascular disease across both race and socioeconomic status. So in the US, we see really distinct racial disparities in cardiovascular disease risk, particularly between white and Black adults in the United States, where we see higher risk for cardiovascular disease among Black Americans, especially compared with whites. And we also see disparities by education level and other indicators of socioeconomic status. So this graph is just showing in the lighter bars, we see people who have less education, and the darker bars, we see people who have more education. And you can see across different cardiovascular diseases that there's a decreasing risk of cardiovascular disease as you have more education. And of course, there's a lot of factors that go into these disparities. Many factors, including resources, access to resources, healthcare, but also stress, and also things that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, like racism and discrimination. So what do we generally know about stress and cardiovascular disease? We know that there are many, many types of stressors that predict cardiovascular disease incidence, cardiovascular disease prevalence, and also mortality rates. I'd be sitting here for days if I told you about even a small portion of the epidemiological research on these relationships. But I just want to give you a few quick examples to give you a sense of the breadth of the field, and then I'll go into some more specific examples as I'm going through my talk. So one of the earliest fields of stress and cardiovascular disease research is job stress. And job stress has a fairly robust relationship with cardiovascular disease risk. So this figure is from a meta-analysis of many different prospective studies or predictive studies of job stress and disease risk. And I'll just highlight a few things. So this is showing that job strain predicts both coronary heart disease and ischemic stroke. Long working hours predict coronary heart disease and stroke. And having job insecurity also predicts cardiovascular disease. Another area of stress and cardiovascular disease research that is growing in recent years, and especially growing during a pandemic when a lot of us are socially isolated, is this focus on cardiovascular disease and loneliness and social isolation. So we know that being socially isolated or experiencing feelings of loneliness is related to increased risk for cardiovascular disease later in life. And as one quick example, this graph is showing the relationship between loneliness and incident coronary heart disease risk. The bottom solid line is the high loneliness group, and you can see that their probability of having a cardiovascular disease, a coronary heart disease event increases at a faster rate compared to those who have low or medium loneliness. And there are many other types of stress that are related to cardiovascular disease and have well-established literatures, especially chronic stress, but also caregiving, which can fall in within chronic stress as well. And then early life adversity is one area that's received a lot of attention in recent years, as well as discrimination. So I'm going to focus a bit more on the last two in the second half of my presentation. But for now, I just want to pause and see, before I move on to the next section, if there's any questions that we have.
Right. So I think you can proceed, because I can see from your presentation that you want to talk about, discrimination as it's related to stress-related condition, because I was going through an article, I believe, research that you were involved to have published and talk about discrimination and its relation to stress and how it induces cardiovascular diseases. So I think you might talk about it. So let's go ahead on that.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so within the health psychology realm, sorry, I just need to move my, having video is on my other screen, but I'll try to fix it in a little while. So one of the main ways that we study cardiovascular disease and stress is by talking about different pathways by which stress might impact cardiovascular disease. So like I said, cardiovascular disease develops over the course of decades, and it's often more useful for us to examine kind of pathways that are connecting cardiovascular disease and stress. And this is partly just due to the time scale. We're not always able or interested in doing decades-long studies. Sometimes we want to examine things on a shorter time scale. And we also want to be able to identify pathways because it increases our opportunities to prevent and intervene. And I'm going to walk you through some of the commonly studied pathways and also a few examples that are a little bit more in depth. So what are some of the pathways that link stress exposure with cardiovascular disease risk? I mean, of course, there's many possible pathways. There's things like psychological factors, emotional responses, mood disturbances, things like depression and anxiety. There's also behavioral factors, things like tobacco use, physical activity, sleep disruption. And there's also physiological factors, so things like blood pressure, heart rate, or even inflammation. And I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of examples of psychological and behavioral pathways, and then I'm going to focus a bit more on physiological factors, sometimes called stress biomarkers, because this is something that I focus a little bit more on, and I also think it's something that people tend to be less familiar with. So to give an example of a psychological pathway, depression is one of the most commonly studied pathways linking stress and cardiovascular disease risk. So we know that stressful life events often precede depressive episodes, especially in particularly vulnerable individuals. Well, what makes someone vulnerable? One vulnerability is having experienced a different type of chronic stress, childhood stress. So people who have experienced, for example, abuse or neglect in childhood have an increased risk of developing depression later in life. In addition, chronic stress is another kind of stress that often precedes or precipitates depressive episodes. So things like ongoing strain from a variety of different sources can often predict depression. And how do we connect this with cardiovascular disease? Well, I'm sure many of you know that depression is a common cardiovascular disease comorbidity. We often see these two co-occur with each other, and we often see depression come before cardiovascular disease, at least clinically speaking. And importantly, this is kind of a multi-factor influence. So depression seems to influence cardiovascular disease at all stages: development, progression, treatment, and also the likelihood of dying. And for these reasons, we really consider depression to be one psychological pathway that links stress with cardiovascular disease. So what about a behavioral pathway? So one behavioral pathway that we think about a lot in stress research is sleep. So it's really well established that stress impacts sleep. So both acute and chronic stress can trigger sleep disruption. So for example, if I'm doing something acutely stressful today or tomorrow, that can trigger acute sleep alterations in my sleep. So I might have trouble sleeping tonight. But chronic stress can also trigger chronic sleep alterations. So if you're experiencing some kind of chronic stress, it also puts you at greater risk for developing chronic sleep problems like insomnia. And I also just want to point out that there really is a bidirectional relationship between stress and sleep. So by that I mean that stress can cause us to sleep more poorly, but also getting poor sleep can increase our stress levels. So getting poor sleep can increase our negative mood or negative affect. It can make our lives feel more stressful because we have less kind of cognitive ability to deal with our stress in our lives because we're deprived of sleep. They really do tend to compound each other. So when it comes to cardiovascular disease, there are pretty well established, again, relationships between sleep and cardiovascular disease risk. We see this with something as minor as sleep duration, so how long are you sleeping? And oftentimes in large studies, we actually see a U-shaped relationship with cardiovascular disease and sleep duration. So people who get little sleep and also people who get a lot of sleep tend to have greater risk for cardiovascular disease. So this particular study is showing that people who get less than 6 hours of sleep have 2 times the relative risk of getting cardiovascular disease compared to those who sleep for 6 to 8 hours. And then the people who get, in this study, it's more than 8 hours, but I believe it usually in other studies, it's showing kind of 9 to 10 and more hours of sleep tend to have higher risk as well. We can talk more about why that is, but a lot of studies do show this U-shaped relationship. And of course, sleep disorders like insomnia and sleep apnea are also linked with cardiovascular events and cardiovascular disease. So thinking about this all together, we really do consider sleep to be a behavioral pathway that links stress with cardiovascular disease. So I want to shift into talking about physiological pathways a little bit more. People often refer to this as kind of biomarkers of stress. And there are lots of different stress-related physiological pathways to examine when it comes to cardiovascular disease. And this is because many physiological variables like blood pressure, heart rate, cortisol, and heart rate variability are all things that are perturbed by stress, and they're linked with cardiovascular disease risk in some way. And I just want to mention that a lot of people have for many years been searching for an objective way to measure stress. So a single biological mediator or biomarker that is indicative that someone is under stress. But I have to tell you that there is no single stress-specific biomarker that we know of. It does not exist. And this is because stress is not the only state that evokes reliable biological changes in some of these same biomarkers. So things like feeling excited or exercises or really focusing our attention on something can lead to some of the same changes or similar changes in these biomarkers as experiencing stress. So not even cortisol, which is popularly deemed the stress hormone, is not specific to stress. Not all cortisol increases are triggered by increases in psychological stress, nor does every experience of stress cause cortisol to rise. So these are not specific. It's something to keep in mind, but we can still examine them in different ways with regard to stress. So with measuring biomarkers of stress, there's 2 kind of main ways that we do it in research and in medicine. Specifically in research is what I'm going to be talking about. But we tend to measure biomarkers of stress either at baseline or resting levels when someone isn't doing anything particularly stressful. So we can measure things like the resting blood pressure, which is often done in clinic settings, and in our case in research settings, or we can measure things like their resting heart rate. And the other way that we do this in research is looking at their acute stress responses. So this involves bringing subjects into the lab, into a controlled lab environment, and exposing them to some kind of acutely stressful situation, and then measuring their physiological responses. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what I mean when I'm talking about resting biomarkers versus kind of these more acutely stressful biomarker measurements. And one kind of interesting physiological mechanism for cardiovascular disease is inflammation. So when we think about inflammation, we typically think about it as an immune response, but I'm sure many of you know that inflammation is involved in the pathophysiology of many different diseases in a way that we don't typically think about as kind of an immune response. So the inflammatory process is, in general, the immune system's initial response after an injury. If you get some kind of wound, the bacteria and other pathogens from the outside world can enter into your body, and the immune system has immune cells in the tissue that are a first line of defense. So they have, one of the first lines of defense is macrophages, which are a cell that has a lot of different purposes, but one of the things they do is that they consume bacteria, and they also produce signaling proteins known as cytokines. So cytokines have several functions, including acting as a signal to more distant immune cells. And they do this by entering into the bloodstream and traveling to other parts of the body to tell other immune cells that help is needed somewhere. And cytokines entering into the bloodstream are often referred to as inflammatory markers. And 2 of the most commonly assessed inflammatory markers are interleukin-6 or IL-6 and C-reactive protein or CRP. I'm going to be talking about IL-6 a little bit more later on, but I should also mention CRP. It's probably something that a lot of the physicians in the audience are more familiar with. It's often done in combination with lipid panels, and it does predict cardiovascular disease risk as well. So when we measure levels of these inflammatory proteins in the blood, we usually refer to them as systemic inflammation. We're measuring them at rest in most cases, right? So what are the levels of IL-6 or CRP in the blood when someone is just sitting, relaxing, not doing anything in particular, as relaxing as a blood draw can be? So why do we care about inflammation in regard to stress and cardiovascular disease research? So stress hormones release, I should say first, a wide variety of stressor exposures are linked with high levels of inflammation. And the reason for this is that stress hormones that are released in response to psychological stress can also act on those same macrophages to trigger production of inflammatory markers into the bloodstream. So it's not just having some kind of physical injury that causes this production of inflammatory markers into the blood. A psychological stressor also triggers a similar kind of production of inflammatory markers. So it's not just a wound that's physical, it can also be a psychological wound or a psychological threat. And we also know that inflammation is really deeply involved in the pathophysiology of cardiovascular disease development. And we know that injury to blood vessels that's a part of the process of cardiovascular disease pathophysiology sets off these inflammatory responses. And of course, we know that higher levels of systemic inflammation, like higher levels of CRP, like I mentioned, but also higher levels of IL-6 predict future cardiovascular disease risk. So taken together, all of this evidence suggests that inflammation is one physiological pathway that links stress exposure with cardiovascular disease risk, particularly when we're looking at these specific cytokines or these specific inflammatory markers. All right, so looping back to talking about measuring biomarkers using acute stress responses, we typically do this, like I mentioned, in a controlled lab environment. To give you an example of what we do when we're doing this kind of study, we're usually asking participants to do some kind of task that's stressful. So one of the most commonly used tasks here is something called the Trier social stress test. And this involves essentially giving a speech to a critical audience that's giving you negative feedback. It also involves difficult arithmetic where you're counting backwards from some high number and being told repeatedly that you're wrong and that you have to start over. So they may seem trivial in comparison to some of the stressors that we experience in our daily life, but even this is enough. These kinds of tasks are enough to have people's bodies show a really strong physiological response. And importantly, there are really significant individual differences in these responses, these physiological responses to these controlled stress tasks. So some people show a large response and some people show smaller changes. And these individual differences are referred to as stress reactivity. So an individual's degree of physiological response to stress is called stress reactivity. And we do this by measuring levels of physiological markers or biomarkers before, during, and after acute stress acute stress tasks in the laboratory. And we can measure all kinds of physiological variables. We can measure autonomic nervous system responses, neuroendocrine responses like cortisol, or immune biomarkers like those inflammatory markers I mentioned. And what does this look like? Well, this is kind of a generic set of data that I pulled from some of my past work. This is heart rate responses and what they look like in response across all participants to a couple different stressors. So we measure at baseline, then we measure after the first stressor, during the first stressor and after the second stressor and recovery. And you see that there is a little bit of a peak in heart rate where it increases in response to the first stressor, then decreases a little bit as they habituate to the second stressor, and then it goes back down to their kind of baseline level during recovery. And again, we see individual differences in this. So some people may show a very strong peak, and some people may show a very flat peak. And this really varies widely across individuals based on many factors. It can vary based on genetic predisposition, early life experiences, history of chronic stress, and a variety of other things. And why do we care about this? So we care about this because of the reactivity hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that states that those who display larger responses to stress are at greater risk for illness. And I should point out that this is not true for all biomarkers, right? So we may see this, see a stronger relationship with things that are related to cardiovascular health, like heart rate reactivity or blood pressure reactivity, whereas we might not see quite as much of a relationship with a physiological measure like respiration. So how hard an individual is breathing or how fast an individual is breathing during a stressor is not necessarily relevant for their health risk. So just to give an example of what a relationship might look like within this stress reactivity or reactivity hypothesis. So this is a study that was conducted by one of my colleagues at University of Pittsburgh that I worked with before. And he did one of these early studies looking at stress reactivity and cardiovascular disease. And this is just showing on the x-axis quartiles of blood pressure responses, where people who are in group 1 have the smallest blood pressure reactivity to stress, and people in group 4 have the largest blood pressure reactivity to stress. And what this graph is showing that as people have higher blood pressure responses, they also have greater carotid intima media thickness. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that measure, it's a preclinical measure of the thickness of their carotid artery. It's essentially a measure of preclinical atherosclerosis in the carotid artery. So the takeaway from this is that these results do support the reactivity hypothesis. So larger blood pressure reactivity means greater preclinical cardiovascular disease risk. So to walk you through an example of acute stress reactivity that kind of goes back to our inflammation example, and this is going to come up a little bit later, when we're measuring inflammation at rest, it's referred to as systemic inflammation, but we can also measure levels of these same cytokines after we expose someone to acute stress in the lab. It doesn't show as quick of a response as we see with something like blood pressure or heart rate, but we still do see a response. So we can test these levels of inflammatory markers circulating in the bloodstream before and after acute stress. So what do these studies look like? So we bring people into the lab, we expose them, first we put in an IV catheter, and then we expose them to some kind of acute stress task. And then they have a period of time where they rest and relax after the stress task. And we take blood samples after the baseline resting period. We also take a sample right after they complete the stress task. And then we complete one or more samples after they've been resting for a while, which has given their body time to respond and show those inflammatory responses. And this is just a schematic to show in general what it looks like. So we tend to see kind of a flattened curve, and then we see this increased acute stress response, especially with IL-6. It tends to happen about 30 minutes after the end of the stressor, but it does rise, we know, at least until about 90 minutes. So our body is continuing to induce those changes in inflammatory proteins in the blood after we've experienced that stressor. Okay, so to summarize a little bit, I'm going to be, to summarize what I talked about in the pathways section, we're really thinking about the relationship between stress and cardiovascular disease in terms of psychological, behavioral, and physiological pathways. And we really study these pathways because cardiovascular disease occurs over the course of decades, and we want to focus on a shorter time scale, and it enables us to really identify earlier opportunities for prevention and intervention before someone develops clinical disease. And I've given you a few examples of different psychological, behavioral, and physiological pathways that might link stress with cardiovascular disease, and also thinking about physiological factors like stress biomarkers that can be measured at baseline or resting or in response to acute stress reactivity. Okay, so in the next section, I'm going to be talking about early life adversity and discrimination. Peter, do we want to do any questions, or are we good?
Right. So talking about the larger stress response and how, it's related to the reactivity hypothesis. So you find out that females are known to have larger or longer, response to stress. What contributes to that? Is it the inflammatory issue, or what results in that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So In some studies, we do see that, but I do think it has to do with the age of women. So in a lot of the studies that we're looking at, women are premenopausal. And so women who are premenopausal tend to be protected from some of the negative impacts of cardiovascular disease development. And that's why we see cardiovascular disease incidence occur later in women compared to men. And it has a lot to do with those, with the, like female stress hormones like estrogen, for example, tend to be protective and also tend to have a reducing effect on inflammation. So that's one of the reasons why we think that we see kind of a smaller response, but it depends on the age, right? So women who are postmenopausal may have more inflammatory reactions to stress.
All right.
Sorry, I'm gonna try to move my, for some reason my video is on my other screen.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, so if you just joined in, we are having an awesome time of learning about psychosocial stress relation to cardiovascular disease. And Dr. Kim has really enlightened us. Personally, I'm so much enlightened about, the various components of stress and how it's related to CVD. So if you just join in, continue to watch it and send in your questions via the comment section on our Facebook wall, and we will read it out for Dr. Kim to just answer. Thank you very much, and we are continuing.
Okay, so I've been able to fix my video. It's now on the proper screen. So now I'm going to talk about some more applications of this kind of research and what we see when we're actually looking at the pathways that link stress with cardiovascular disease and in some of my own research. And so first I'm going to focus on talking a little bit about early life adversity, and I'll give you an example of a physiological pathway that I've examined there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about discrimination and give you an example of a behavioral pathway. So early life adversity, I'm sure that many of you know or can think of what this might mean. Early life adversity or adverse childhood experiences refer to stressors that people experience during childhood, like abuse, neglect, experiencing or witnessing violence, substance misuse or mental health problems, or instability in the home, but also things like deprivation and poverty. And what do we know about the relationship with cardiovascular disease? Well, we know that adverse childhood experiences show a pretty robust relationship with cardiovascular disease risk. So for example, reporting 7 or more adverse childhood experiences leads to at least 3 times greater risk of developing ischemic heart disease. And we really see a dose-response relationship here. So by that I mean that the more adverse childhood experiences that someone has had in their lifetime or in their childhood, the more risk that they have for developing cardiovascular disease. And just to give you a sense of how consistent this relationship is across studies, a meta-analysis that was done in 2017 on maltreatment, so childhood maltreatment and cardiovascular disease risk, found that in 91.7% of existing studies on this topic, there was a significant relationship between childhood maltreatment and cardiovascular disease. And within stress and health research, that is a very consistent relationship. And so I think it's important to think about just how robust this relationship is and how much we still don't know about it. So we know that there's this link between stress, so early life stress and cardiovascular disease risk. And one question that many people want to know is, how does this happen? How does early life stress really get under the skin to impact later cardiovascular disease risk? So one explanation for this is that early life stress impacts the development of physiological stress systems. So it impacts the development of our stress response systems. And this developmental impact is really thought to influence how our bodies respond to stress for the rest of our lives. So things that we experience in childhood, if we experience some kind of trauma in childhood, it can impact the way our bodies learn how to respond to stress at a young age, and that can dictate how we're responding to stress as adults. And a possible biomarker of interest here is inflammation. So I talked about it a little bit already, but you should know that systemic inflammation also tends to be higher in people who experienced early life adversity, particularly early life trauma, but also early life socioeconomic deprivation. And one kind of hypothesis about why this might be is that people's bodies are, people who have experienced early life stress, their bodies are producing more inflammatory proteins in response to these psychological stressors as adults. So they have greater inflammatory stress reactivity, like I was talking about in the last section. But people haven't actually tested this before. So there are a number of data sets in which you can look at this, but I decided I wanted to test whether one form of early life adversity might impact people's inflammatory stress reactivity as adults, and think about whether this would go into the context of cardiovascular disease. And in the study that I'm going to talk about, I really just focused on the front half of that model. So does a form of early life adversity predict greater inflammatory stress reactivity in adulthood? So this is a laboratory study that I'm going to talk about. Participants were 110 healthy adults between the ages of 40 and 58. So these participants were generally healthy. So this is before they had developed any kind of clinical cardiovascular disease manifestations. And here we measured as our marker of childhood adversity. It was really a proxy measure. So we asked people about their childhood socioeconomic status. So the reason that we did this is because we were doing, remember when I talked about measurement assessment windows at the beginning, we're asking people about their childhood experiences retrospectively. So they're having to answer questions about things in childhood. And generally speaking, it tends to be easier for people to remember things like whether or not their parents owned their home, or whether they owned cars, or how many cars, and how many people lived in their house versus how many bedrooms were in the house. So it's really a measure of kind of family assets. And this tends to be a little bit easier to remember than something like their parents' income at a given age, or how prestigious their parents' occupation was at a given age. So it's a little bit more concrete, and that can be helpful when we're measuring something like this that happened years before. So after giving us this detailed interview on their childhood socioeconomic status, they did a laboratory protocol for inflammatory stress reactivity. And here we measured IL-6, which I mentioned earlier. And this protocol looked really similar to the kind of sample protocol I showed you earlier. They came in for the study, they got the IV catheter put in, they did this baseline resting period, and then they did a stress task, and then they had a 30-minute rest period after the stress task. And we took blood samples after the rest period, at the beginning, after the stress task, and then 30 minutes after the stress task ended. And I should mention that the stress task that they did here was a speech task where they had to defend themselves against a false accusation of a traffic violation or shoplifting. And this tended to be a very potent stressor for people. It really activated a lot of physiological but also emotional stress for people. So kind of the main question that I want to focus on here is, was early life disadvantage associated with greater inflammatory reactivity to stress? So here we're assuming, again, that the disadvantage measure is really a proxy measure for early life adversity. So it's assumed that people who have lower family assets, lower socioeconomic status in childhood experienced more disadvantage, more adversity. And so we did find that lower childhood socioeconomic status was associated with larger inflammatory stress reactivity. And so this is just a visual representation of that. The graph is showing the time in the study on the x-axis and IL-6 levels on the y-axis. And you can see that the stress occurred during that gray bar that's there. The black line on top is participants who reported low early life socioeconomic status, and the bottom line is the light gray line is participants who reported high early life socioeconomic status. So you can see that the participants who reported low early life socioeconomic status or more disadvantage not only started out higher in their levels of IL-6, but they also had more of an increase in those IL-6 levels in response to the stressor. So they had more reactivity. So this really does support that idea that participants who experience more adversity during childhood have a stronger inflammatory reactivity response in adulthood. So just to summarize, inflammatory stress reactivity is one possible physiological pathway. It's not the only one that we can look at here, but it's one that we can look at in terms of linking stress with cardiovascular disease risk. And here we did find that early life socioeconomic disadvantage is associated with greater inflammatory stress reactivity in adulthood. And of course, there are some caveats to this, right? So measuring people's socioeconomic status retrospectively is not a perfect way of doing this, right? It would be much better if we had reports or actual numbers from when they were growing up so that we could have some sort of objective measure of what they experienced. So this is really just a starting period or a starting kind of a way to start thinking about this, and it would be ideal if we could use some of the existing studies that are kind of longitudinal and ongoing, where we have actual measures of their socioeconomic status, like income and education, when they were children, and see how that predicts their responses once they're adults. But it does give us a little bit of a place to start. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about discrimination, but are there any questions specifically about the early life disadvantage portion?
Right, sure. So I think people who are listening to us are shocked, as I was, to see the level of percentage of that kind of a risk of adverse childhood experiences, and it's very alarming. One of our listeners want to find out that peradventure you have gone through these adverse reactions when you were a child, like maltreatment and all those things. Is there a way to, or something to do to kind of ameliorate the effect that you will have, in the adulthood? Like, because you pose a risk to some of these cardiovascular conditions, but you have been through. Is there a way to kind of halt the emergence of all these risks that you can have in the adulthood? I don't know if you understand the direction of the question.
Can you restate it?
Right. So,
like, is it unusual that we see this compared to other kind of measures of stress?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, there are definitely people who have been through some of these childhood maltreatment, and there's that prediction that there's a higher risk onto these cardiovascular conditions. Is that a way that such people can go through they can do maybe some measures of stress management that they can go through so that they don't experience this adverse effect?
Yeah, so what can we do about it? Yeah, I think that really is the central question here. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can think about, right? So first, I just want to say that just because someone has experienced childhood trauma does not mean that this is going to happen to them, right? So these are averages across people, but there are a lot of things that we can think about when it comes to resilience. So not everyone who experiences trauma is going to have health issues. There are contributors to kind of having these more resilient profiles. And some of those are things during childhood that really counteract those experiences. So say that you had a lot of childhood trauma when you were in your first few years of life, but that someone came into your life who was more of a supportive kind of role model or a figure in your life who kind of supported you and gave you more of a sense of meaning and purpose and stability. That is something that actually has been shown to kind of buffer those negative effects of the maltreatment or trauma that you might have experienced. So when we're thinking kind of in childhood, what can we do about it? Having those kinds of supportive systems, whether it comes from an adult, like a family member who's outside of your direct family environment, or having even a teacher at school who is more of a supportive source, having someone like that in a child's life can play a huge, huge role in kind of reducing those negative effects. So these things are malleable. You know, it's not something that we should think about as a death sentence, and we really shouldn't. We should be thinking about it more in terms of, okay, we know that this is a risk for this person. We've screened it. We've found out that they've experienced trauma. What can we do about it while they're still a child to try to kind of counteract that? So, you know, that's one of the easiest and simplest things, is having someone who's a stable support. But also you can think about things like, you know, having like if we're in adulthood, right? So say someone had a really traumatic childhood all the way through, and now they're adults, right? There's still a lot that we can think about in terms of stress management, and we have these learned responses. It's not just our bodies that have a learned response to stress. We also have a way of thinking about stress that causes us to react to stress in a certain way. And something that can be really helpful with that is cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm not a clinician myself, but one of the most common forms of cognitive behavioral therapy when you go to a psychologist is focusing on stress management. So focusing on your thought patterns when you experience a stressor. What are you telling yourself about the stressor? How are you telling yourself to respond to it mentally? How are you dealing with it? But also, what kinds of behaviors are you carrying out to kind of impact the way that you're dealing with a stressor? So are you using more kind of maladaptive, we usually refer to them maladaptive kind of behavioral responses like substance use, or are you doing something like doing a more calming activity like focusing on mindfulness, or doing more physical activity, because sometimes that can be a big stress reduction, or seeking out social support. So cognitive behavioral therapy is something that really tries to get at those, our kind of learned responses to a stressor and reshape them into a way that's healthier in the way that we're thinking about them, and healthier in the way that we're behaviorally responding. And that can trickle down to how our bodies are responding to stress. So I don't want people to see this and think that it's everybody who experiences trauma it's doomed. There's things that we can do when people are still children, but we have to know about the stressors before we can kind of give those, before we can really implement those solutions.
Yeah, so I think it's very encouraging to know that. So I believe that many societies lack such supporting systems. In fact, some societies believe that, the child needs to go through that straight level of treatment so that the child can come out to be a good adult and all that. So, there's that maltreatment that is being justified with discipline or training the child in all that, right? So I think it's good that support systems can really, really help to really curb this thing. And I think people might take you for that, because in any level of our growth, I think we need some level of support system that can keep us through, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also point out that, kind of like what you're mentioning, there's really significant cultural differences in what's considered to be, appropriate kind of discipline or punishment, right? So, more kind of physical punishment tends to be more common in some cultures than others. And there's been some really interesting research that's shown with that. And I'm not saying that I endorse any kind of physical punishment in general, but when physical punishment is really combined with a loving and supportive environment, some minor forms of it have less of an impact than when that physical punishment is combined with a harsh, like kind of negligent, cold environment. So again, not endorsing that in any way, but I know that there are really kind of significant cultural differences in what's considered appropriate discipline. And when discipline is paired with a warm and loving, supportive environment, it can be less damaging.
Right. And about the socioeconomic disadvantage, what measures really contribute to that, right? Because I think mainly when we talk about socioeconomic disadvantage, many people will think of maybe level of living with respect to whether you are wealthy or you're not wealthy. But in many societies where people are having low status in their socioeconomic structure, but then they feel excited, they are motivated to do what they're supposed to do. So I'm not sure maybe wealth is a good measure of that status. What do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's a lot of different ways that we can measure socioeconomic status. This measure that we use here was pretty crude, but something else that I think tends to be kind of a more advanced way of looking at this is thinking about socioeconomic growth, right? So people, or socioeconomic trajectories, right? So even if someone starts out with a low socioeconomic status and then they're able to kind of pull themselves out of it, they might have a different health trajectory compared to someone who kind of remains in the low socioeconomic status. We actually don't know that much about those trajectories and how they are related to health. It's something that really is an area that needs to be studied more. I'll also say that these measures of kind of these more, they're called objective measures of socioeconomic status, aren't everything. I tend to also look at people's subjective status reports. So where do they perceive that they fall compared to other people in their community? Where do they perceive, like, what is their status within their community or within their country? And how is that related to health? And that often taps into a little bit more of people's kind of ideas about what their position is and how they feel in relation to other people. And I think that that can kind of tap into some kind of like a self-esteem component that you're talking about. Like, even though I'm disadvantaged, I still am able to have an important role in my community. I still do things for people in my community that makes us all better and makes us more connected. So it taps into more of that kind of that, like, the status component that's more internal, rather than kind of focusing on these really crude kind of objective measures like wealth or income. And those subjective status measures also tend to link with health. So we see people who think that, who perceive themselves to have higher status in their communities, they also tend to have better health.
Right, thank you. Mm-hmm. I think we can proceed.
Okay, all right, so I'm going to talk about another stressor, kind of another example of how to do this kind of pathway research. And I'm going to focus a bit on discrimination. And I'm sure most of you know what discrimination is, but discrimination is really treating a person unfairly based on a group to which that person identifies. This is the very basic definition of discrimination. It sort of gets at interpersonal discrimination of like how one person is treated, but we also can think of discrimination really as a systemic issue, something that's built into kind of the fabric of the institutions of a given country or the fabric of organizations. So I'm going to focus particularly on kind of individual experiences of discrimination, but we should have in mind that this is part of a broader context. And of course, groups can be based on a group that that person identifies with, like race, age, or sex. And as you might guess, discrimination is reported substantially more by groups that are also at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. So in the United States, Black Americans and individuals of lower socioeconomic status tend to report more discrimination, and they're also at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And again, I just want to point out that I'm focusing here on US research. This is the area that I'm most familiar with and where I do research. But I want you all to be thinking about how this applies to your culture or your country. What are the kind of minority groups or oppressed groups that this might apply to, and what kind of research, you can look at what kind of research is being done in your specific area that's relevant to this. So there's really increasing scientific attention to the possible role that discrimination plays in health disparities. Since 2000, over 800 studies have been published on the link between discrimination and health. And this body of work taken together really indicates that self-reported experiences of discrimination, especially on the individual level, are associated with poor mental health and physical health, including chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease. And with recent social shifts and increasing discussion about race and discrimination in the US, this scientific work has really started to catch the attention of the public, and people are starting to demand change, and that's as it should be. You know, there are a lot of social components to these disparities that we see. We're seeing a lot of, I'm focusing on cardiovascular disease, but there are really, really strong disparities that we're seeing in COVID, especially by race and socioeconomic status. So what do we know about discrimination and cardiovascular disease? Again, I'm going to be focusing on these more interpersonal experiences of discrimination and how people are reporting that they've perceived discrimination from others. And we know that perceived discrimination tends to be associated with higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And this is true both in preclinical measures of cardiovascular disease, as well as in clinical cardiovascular disease. So for example, cardiovascular events. And we actually see this association across different racial and ethnic groups. We can measure discrimination not just in terms of race, but we can measure it in terms of things like experiencing discrimination based on your gender or on your sexual identity or sexual orientation, but also things like disability status. So we do see this relationship between perceived discrimination and elevated risk for cardiovascular disease, but it does tend to be the strongest among Black Americans in the US. And of course, given that Black Americans also tend to report higher levels of perceived discrimination, it's also possible that perceived discrimination contributes specifically to these cardiovascular disease disparities. So I want to talk about a specific behavioral pathway that I've been looking at in some of my work, and that's sleep, which I mentioned earlier. So sleep is really a prime candidate for looking at a behavioral factor that might contribute to this relationship. So higher perceived discrimination is linked with poor sleep, and this has been shown across a lot of different measures of sleep. So for example, sleep, basically people's reports of how good their sleep was, so sleep quality, how disturbed their sleep was, whether they had sleep problems, but also things like insomnia or clinical manifestations of sleep issues. But we don't really know a lot about the interrelationships between discrimination, sleep, and cardiovascular disease. So how are they all related to each other? Is it a pathway like I've been talking about where one influences the other and that influences the other? Or is it an interaction? Is it the combination of poor sleep and discrimination? And if this is confusing, I'm going to give you a visual representation. So the pathway model is kind of how I've been talking about these things so far. So does the stress of discrimination trigger poor sleep, which then increases the risk for cardiovascular disease? And this is the way a lot of people think about this, but people haven't actually really tested it in large data sets or really in any data sets at all. But a lot of people think that there could also be an interaction. So it's not a pathway model necessarily, but it's something about the combination of experiencing discrimination plus also getting poor sleep that really triggers those negative cardiovascular risk factors. So I wanted to look at this in some of the data that I had. This is 123 healthy Black and white adults between the ages of 25 and 52. And again, these are people who do not have any kind of clinical cardiovascular disease. We wanted to look at them before they get any kind of clinical illness. They completed 14 days of daily diaries where they did basically a quick survey at the end of each day that talked about their experiences of everyday discrimination or sort of day-to-day mundane experiences of discrimination that can make people feel very negative, but they're not necessarily big violent events. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that these everyday experiences of discrimination that people are experiencing on a regular basis also really contribute to health. In those daily diaries, we also asked them about whether they had sleep disturbances the night before. So what kind of problems did they have with sleeping? How many disturbances did they have, essentially? So did they wake up a lot in the middle of the night? And then we had them come in after they did those diaries, we had them come in for a laboratory assessment of resting blood pressure. They did a couple other measures during that time, but I'm going to focus on blood pressure here just as an indicator of cardiovascular disease risk, as it's been used, it's used clinically a lot of the time to predict people's cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, so did we see this pathway model? Does the stress of discrimination trigger poor sleep, which also predicts high blood pressure? So we actually did not find support for this model. So I was a bit surprised about this. The sleep problems that people reported in this study were not related to their blood pressure afterwards. And this is something that may be specific to the time scale of the study, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But when we looked at this more interactive model, so is it the combination of perceived discrimination and sleep problems that's relevant for blood pressure? We did find support for this model. So just to show you some quick figures of what this looks like. So these two graphs are showing sleep disturbances that they reported in the diaries over the x-axis, and then their systolic and diastolic blood pressure on the y-axis. And you can see here that the three lines here are showing three groups of participants based on how much discrimination they reported during the daily diary period. And you can see that this high discrimination group, so people who reported high discrimination over the course of the 14 days, showed the highest levels of blood pressure when combined with also having poor sleep. So it's really the participants who report high discrimination and who had poor sleep who had the highest diastolic and systolic blood pressure. So just to summarize, the findings that I showed you here didn't support sleep as a behavioral pathway between perceived discrimination and blood pressure. But I just want to point out that this is a pretty cross-sectional study. So the time period between when they were experiencing this discrimination and sleep problems and when we measure their blood pressure, it wasn't a very long period. It would be much better to look at this in future work, looking at this more longitudinally. So do sleep problems and discrimination over the course of a year predict blood pressure in the following year? So there's a lot of opportunities that are coming up to use this kind of daily data to predict future health, and that would be something that we could really use to examine this sleep behavioral pathway here. So I'm excited to think about that a little bit more in the future. But the findings did support an interaction between discrimination and getting poor sleep in predicting blood pressure. So it really seemed that the combination of experiencing day-to-day discrimination and also having sleep problems was particularly toxic for blood pressure, which suggests greater risk for future cardiovascular disease. So to summarize, I've just given you 2 examples of different pathways that might link different stressor exposures with cardiovascular disease risk. And of course, this is just a very small sample of things that you can do with this kind of modeling. There's lots of different ways to look at these pathways and also lots of different pathways that I didn't mention here. But I do hope that this gives you a sense of kind of different ways to approach the relationship between stress and cardiovascular disease and how many health psychologists are trying to examine this to understand what the exposures are doing to our body and our behaviors and our minds. Okay, so I have a quick kind of concluding part, but I think we can loop back to questions right after that.
Right. Right. So you want to finish with the takeaway, right?
Yeah, it's like 3 slides, so we can.
All right.
So in terms of kind of takeaways that I want you to have from this presentation, I want you to understand the complexity of stress and how it affects health. It's not one thing, it's a lot of different things, and it can affect a lot of different attributes of our life. And both stressor exposure and stress responses are important for health. It's not just one or the other. And they're both important for cardiovascular disease risk specifically. And also that there are many pathways that link stress and cardiovascular disease risk. There's psychological, behavioral, and physiological pathways. And for me and for clinicians as well, it's really helpful to identify pathways when we're really considering targets for prevention and intervention before patients develop clinical disease. The goal is to try to really use this as an opportunity. So think about these pathways and what their opportunities are for study, but also clinical consideration. So I know that we have a lot of physicians in the audience and probably some researchers as well, but I want to target a little bit more, where do you go from here as a clinician? So I have some questions for you to consider. I do not have answers to these questions. These are things to be thinking about broadly, and I would love to discuss them if people are interested in that as well. But I want you to think about how this information is relevant to your work as a clinician. How is it relevant to your work as a physician or a future physician? How do you want to think about stress when you're thinking about health and cardiovascular disease risk? And how can you integrate the existing knowledge that's coming out of this kind of pathway research into your practice? I also want you to think about whether your patients have experienced these stressor exposures that might make them more vulnerable to disease. The only way of really knowing this is by asking, right? So are you screening your patients for common or especially toxic stressors? If you're not doing that yet, or if you're not a practicing physician yet, how do you think you might implement this? And how might there be ways that you can do this in a way that's both sensitive and confidential, but also a way for you to get that information so you can understand vulnerabilities? And then the next question that's going to be very relevant to, I think, most of you is, are you providing your patients with support in managing the effects of these stressors? And if not, how might you start doing this? This is a very complicated question. It's a difficult question. I think it depends a lot on resources. And that's a difficult thing to face in terms of how we're thinking about who is experiencing these stressors and who has the resources to get support for them. But you as a clinician can still be thinking about ways that you can kind of help your patients be managing these stressors in terms of what you're referring them to. But first you have to know if they're experiencing them. So if you're not providing patients with support, how might you start doing this? And then lastly, I just want to point out that the Stress Network has a lot of resources for stress measurement, a lot of ways to think about and study stress, but also kind of try to capture some of these experiences that your patients, my participants, might be experiencing. There's a lot of resources on our website, which is stressmeasurement.org. And again, these are focused more on the research side of things, but we're really open to talking with clinicians and physicians about different ways of measuring stress. Okay, so I am open for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Right, so I think the question I want to get a clarity on is about still the racial disparities and the fact that many researchers still go on to confirm the fact that you have the Black race having, high acute reactivity to stress and slower, reaction to it as well. Yeah. So, what do you think about that? What do you think causes that the Black race about having a very high acute stress response?
Yeah, I think it's complicated, right? I think that part of it might be kind of similar to what I was talking about with childhood stress. So something having to do with the way your physiological systems are developing when you're experiencing some kind of basically experiencing a difficult or a toxic environment. So if you live in a country, for example, where people of your race, so for example, in the United States, Black Americans are really experiencing chronic stress through discrimination from the time they're quite young, that can have an impact on the development of those physiological stress response systems that can basically make your systems primed to show a greater response. So a lot of people have heard of the fight or flight response. So it's your body preparing itself to either fight against a threat or flee. And it basically is just a huge slew of stress hormones that get released into the body when you're facing some kind of stressor, whether it's a stressor that might be attacking you or a psychological stressor. We're showing these big ramp up increases. So within this kind of area of research with regard to health disparities, especially among Black Americans in the United States, there's this idea that there's a kind of increased hypervigilance or being vigilant to your environment so that you can respond quickly to something that's stressful or difficult in an acute sense. So it kind of is focused on this vigilance for threat. So do I have to be prepared at all times to respond to something that might be a threatening circumstance? And will my body launch this really big response so that I'm more prepared to deal with it? So that's kind of like the theoretical thinking about why do Black Americans show these bigger responses? And I also want to point out that this is really nuanced, right? So again, I'm looking a lot of times at kind of averages across groups of people, but that's not true for all people, right? It's not true for all Black Americans. It's not that all Black Americans show larger kind of the stress reactivity response. There's going to be individual differences, and there's going to be a lot of reasons for those individual differences. So perhaps having more access to a supportive community or having kind of more of a closeness or an identity with your community, but also things like having a supportive social environment, having a supportive home environment. Those things can be really buffering, so really protective, and kind of can increase that psychological and physiological resilience.
Right. Thank you, madam. So apart from the cardiovascular stress that it imposes, what effect did you see, especially in your studies, in relation to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical system and also the immune system? What effect did you have in respect to these racial disparities?
Yeah, so I focused a lot more on inflammation. So you can tell from the earlier part of my talk, that's something that I focus on a little bit more in my research. But we really do see Specifically for people who report more discrimination, they tend to have higher levels of that systemic inflammation at rest. And also in general, African Americans in the US and also Latinos in the United States tend to have higher levels of that resting systemic inflammation. There haven't been a lot of studies that look at that inflammatory reactivity that I was talking about. I don't know of any that specifically focus on discrimination and inflammatory reactivity. That's something that is kind of a newer area. But we know that we see in terms of kind of those resting levels of those inflammatory markers like CRP and IL-6, we tend to see higher levels of them in most studies, but it's not true in all studies, and it's not true for all people. So some studies find this to be more the case among African-American women, but not African-American men. Some studies find this across all racial groups, so including white participants, people who report experiencing more any kind of discrimination, not specific to race discrimination, tend to show higher levels of those systemic inflammatory markers.
Right. Thank you. And one of our listeners just noted that, he has come across a lot of relation between caregivers predicting cardiovascular diseases. And what do you think? Is it a stress-induced relation, or how is that related?
Yeah, absolutely. Caregiving is a really, really potent stressor. It's not something I focus on specifically in my research, but a lot of my colleagues do. One of my closest colleagues, who's one of the Stress Network associate directors, focuses a lot of her research on caregiving. And caregiving itself, it's a multidimensional stressor, right? So not only are you focusing a lot of your energy on thinking about the needs of someone else, it's also just a lot to balance taking care of two lives. It's a lot to balance taking care of your own life, but also if you're caregiving for a child who has special needs, for example, or if you're caregiving for a spouse who has dementia, you're not just dealing with caregiving. You're not just dealing with kind of controlling your own life, but you have to predict the needs of another individual's life at all times, and you're responsible for them. And it's not just the case, obviously taking care of a child in general is a very difficult thing to do, but having that extra layer that other people aren't dealing with, other people aren't necessarily dealing with having a child with special needs, for example, it's a bit isolating as well, because you're spending so much time focusing on their needs and less time focusing on your own needs. So it's harder to have your needs met in terms of how you're coping with stress when you're also dealing with the needs of another person as well. And yeah, it's an extremely potent stressor, and it tends to be chronic, right? A lot of times caregiving can last for, if you're thinking about it in a short-term context, perhaps I thought about this with my husband had a ankle injury, and he was on crutches for 4 months. And so I was doing a lot of caregiving for him during that time, but caregiving often lasts for years and years. So, dealing with a partner who has, or caregiving for a partner who has dementia that, kind of takes place over the course of many years, that's a lot of time that you're focusing on someone else's needs and not focusing on your own needs. And it's necessary a lot of the time. Most of the time people don't have a choice, but I think there has to be more support for caring for caregivers as clinicians.
Right, so that's great. So finally, we have had a lot of people wanting to know the coping mechanisms that they can use to survive this pandemic situation. In fact, this pandemic comes with a lot of psychological stress in so many different ways. So what will you kind of prescribe in a sense of coping mechanism for people to be sustained in this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a huge question. I will say that coping is specific to each person, right? So some things that work for me are not going to work for other people. So there's a lot of differences in what's going to work for a given person. So it's important for everyone to try to identify what works for them. And that's going to take some trial and error, right? You're going to have to try some new things if you feel like you're not coping effectively. And I'll also just say that it's normal to be experiencing a lot of stress during this. And I think normalizing that for everyone and realizing that there's not a lot that we can do we can't get rid of the stressor here, right? Like we can't eliminate it. There's not things that we can do to make the pandemic go away, right? Of course, there's people who are working toward vaccines and things like that, but us as individuals, most of the time, we're not going to be able to get rid of it. So we should focus more on the things that make us kind of feel like we're able to get through each day better. So for a lot of people, this can look like starting a mindfulness practice. So this can be done through, there's a lot of different apps that you can use for it. But even if you don't have access to, if you don't have access to an app like, Calm, for example, you can still try to find a time every day to set aside to have 5 minutes where you're sitting and resting and relaxing and trying not to focus on other things. This can be really difficult when your mind is filled with all of the information about how difficult things are. But mindfulness really involves acknowledging those thoughts that you're having. So acknowledging those stressful thoughts that you're having and saying, this is okay, this is normal. I'm just going to take a few minutes for myself and I'm going to try to just relax a little bit. And it's okay that I'm having these stressful thoughts. It's okay. And here I am just giving myself some time. And even just doing that for a few minutes a day, and that's accessible to a lot of people, that's accessible to all of us. Taking those few minutes to do that can be really helpful. It does not work for everyone. Other things that people can do are more behavioral practices that they find to be enjoyable or calming. So for example, exercising. A lot of people try to have some kind of physical activity every day to try to make themselves kind of have more of a sense of calm, more of a sense of routine when a lot of our routines have gotten very messed up. And that doesn't mean you have to go outside. A lot of people can't go outside right now. You can do things inside of your own home. If you have access to the internet, you can do workouts from the internet. A lot of organizations are doing kind of free workout videos. You can also do something really simple that doesn't require that, like jumping jacks or push-ups or sit-ups. So just doing something, running in place. I was part of a health coaching organization, and one of my participants lived in a really dangerous neighborhood, and she didn't want to go outside to exercise. And so she ended up every day, she had a circle that she walked around her house and went upstairs and downstairs, and she had like a route around her house that she did, and then she stood and held her bed frame and ran in place for 10 minutes. So you can get creative if you can't go outside, and there are really interesting physiological changes that impact how our body is feeling, but also how our brain is working when we're responding to stress. So exercise can be a great one. But yeah, in general, I would say that the most crucial thing is to find something that works for you. And for a lot of people, that can be incorporating behaviors that are comforting into your routine. So exercising, mindfulness, cooking, connecting with friends over the phone on a regular basis, connecting with friends over video chatting, having like ways to really connect with other people can be such an important part of this when we're feeling so isolated. So trial and error, try different things. The only thing that's not going to work is doing nothing. So.
Okay, that's great. That is great. We are so much grateful, Dr. Kim, for joining us. I mean, it's so encouraging and it's so insightful for the things that you have explained to us. We are grateful that even amidst your busy schedules, you could just make time for this webinar. We are grateful, and we thank Dr. Elisa for recommending you to us as well. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to have had you. So we thank you to our audience for joining us for this edition of Preventive Health webinar series. This is the first of a kind, and we are going to continue with other seasoned facilitators to help us. Next week, which is on the 17th of June, we are going to host Dr. Daniel Rajan. Dr. Daniel Rajan is an orthopedic surgeon in the UK, and he is going to take us through to analyze how to be fit even in this COVID pandemic. So you can't afford to miss it as well. So you can just like and follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you will just stay updated to everything that goes on in this Prevent First Commission page. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have had you. Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.